Hello folks, and welcome to this week's lesson in phlebotomy. Today we're going to be reviewing Chapter 5, Human Anatomy and Physiology. And just to briefly review the major concepts of learning about the human body, some of our objectives include 1. Demonstrate basic knowledge of the terminology, functions, and organization of the body. 2. Describe functions, identify components or major structures, correctly use terminology associated with each body system. And 3. List disorders and diagnostic tests commonly associated with each body system. So, as it shows here, the human body is an amazing machine. It's composed of over, what it says, 30 trillion cells, 206 bones in the adult skeleton, actually more so in the infant skeleton, 700 different muscles, about anywhere between 5 to 6 liters of blood, depending on your body size, and a surface area of about 25 miles of blood vessels. So when we use the terms anatomy and physiology, it's important to understand the difference. The term anatomy, as it says here, refers to the structural composition of the body and the parts of the body. In other words, its form and basic makeup. Where is it found? What does it look like? What are its parts? Where physiology has to do more with the function. How does it work? What does it do? So you have to have a little bit of an understanding of the different components. And it says here, the medical science and specialty practice concerned with all aspects of disease, including characteristic causes and effects of disease on the structure and function of the body, is called pathology. There is a separate pathology course in the biology department. It's definitely an interesting subject. It's something that's been brought into the emergency medical technician curriculum over the last few years. Specialists in this field are called pathologists, but to have a good understanding of pathology will really help you understand disease processes if you decide to take your career and your training and your education further into the medical field. So whenever we're referring to anything regarding the human body, we always make reference to what's called the anatomic position. The anatomic position, I wish I had a slide here to show you, but it involves the point of reference where the body is standing upright, facing forward, arms at the sides, and palms facing forward. So when you use the terms left and right, you're always referring to the patient's left and the patient's right, which would be the complete opposite of your perspective if you were staring at that patient face to face. The term supine refers to the position of the human body found with the back to the floor facing straight up. So you can actually see that little word in there, up. This way I help remember it is supine. There's the word up in it. They're face up. When a patient is lying prone, that's just the opposite. They're lying face down, which is never a good position to find a patient, whether in bed or on the floor. When we landmark certain parts of the body, and this is especially important when you're taking classes in EKG and other medical classes, we divide the bodies into different sections. There's called planes. There is the frontal or coronal plane, which, if you can imagine a sheet of glass cutting the body in half between a front and back part. Anything towards the front of the body is considered anterior. Anything to the back of the body is considered posterior. A sagittal plane separates the body to the left and the right sides. Remember, it's always the patient's left, the patient's right. And if you can imagine a line straight down the middle of the body, that would separate the body into the sagittal plane. And then a transverse or a horizontal plane would separate body parts between the upper part or superior part and lower part or inferior parts as well. As we said before, anything in reference to the front of the body would be considered anterior. So, for example, the breastbone, the sternum, would be anterior to the heart. Anything towards the back side of the body would be considered posterior. So the spinal column, for example, would be considered posterior to the digestive tract. Anything going towards the head would be considered superior, like your superiors on a job. And anything in reference towards the feet or the lower aspects of the body would be considered inferior or lower. When we talk about things in reference closer and away from the midline of the body, we use the terms medial and lateral. So medial refers closer to the middle or the midline of the body. The word medial kind of sounds like middle, doesn't it? Whereas anything lateral would be considered away from the body. So if anybody's familiar with football, you know that when the quarterback throws a lateral pass, they're throwing the ball to the side, out to the receiver, rather than forward or backwards. Now, the body is also subdivided into various compartments, or what we call cavities. These are either open spaces or potentially open spaces that house and contain different organs or organ systems. So going from superior to inferior, we start with the cranial cavity, which is the big open space within the skull. It's not really open because it houses and contains the brain and the major structures of the brain. In the posterior aspect of the body, you have what's called the spinal cavity, which houses the spinal column, including all the vertebrae and the structures of the spinal cord within the vertebrae. The thoracic cavity is a big, huge dome-like structure that makes up your chest. In other words, it's the chest cavity. And what's housed inside the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity? Well, you have your lungs, your heart, your aorta, your esophagus, and some other structures like your thymus gland and some others. In the thoracic cavity is separated from the abdominal cavity, which houses all the organs and accessory organs of the digestive system, the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, just to name a few. And the thoracic cavity and abdominal cavity are anatomically separated by this sheet of muscle called the diaphragm, which is essential for a normal respiratory function. As the diaphragm contracts, it allows the chest cavity to expand, pulling the lungs open, drawing air in from the atmosphere to enable a normal ventilation. Now, on the lower end of the abdominal cavity, you have what's called the pelvic cavity, which is not really anatomically separated from the abdominal cavity, but it houses the major reproductive and urinary organs. But it's more of a visual landmark than it is an anatomical one. So I'm sure back in early 6th and 7th grade science class, you've heard this term homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Well, it's a state of equilibrium or balance in the body's internal environment. The body has many mechanisms for maintaining a relatively constant internal environment despite multiple changes in environment in the outside world. It maintains by compensating for changes. For example, when you are hungry, when your blood sugar drops too low, what happens? You start feeling hungry. You eat something. You introduce it into your digestive system. Your digestive system breaks it down. It breaks the food into all the components of fats, carbohydrates, proteins. The carbohydrates are further broken down into sugars or glucose, released into the bloodstream, and the blood sugar level elevates. Now, to keep the blood sugar level from elevating too much, the body senses the levels of glucose in the blood, and if the levels go too high, the pancreas secretes insulin to store the excess glucose into the muscles and into the liver to maintain a proper steady state of blood sugar. Now, as the day goes by, that blood sugar level drops a little further again. What happens? You become hungry, you start eating. If you don't have access to food right away, the liver starts breaking down stored glucose in the form of glycogen and releases it into the bloodstream to maintain that steady state of homeostasis. And that's just one example of how the body maintains homeostasis. The term metabolism refers to the sum of all physical and chemical reactions needed to sustain life. It's too many reactions in the human body to even name, but to subdivide them into proper terms, you have a catabolic reaction, or form of catabolism, in which complex substances are broken down, usually with the release of energy. So, for example, carbohydrates are broken down into glucose. And glucose is broken down further to enable the use of ATP and energy. Where anabolic processes, or anabolism, maybe you've heard the term anabolic steroids, what did they do? They help build things up. So simple compounds are converted to more complex substances, such as amino acids being built up into proteins, proteins being built up into structures, and so on. The body, or any living organism, is made up of a very complex hierarchy of levels of organization. So the most basic level is at the chemical level, which involves, even before what we see here, the most basic chemical level involves atoms, molecules, and bonds between these structures. Then the chemicals that make up the basic substances of life: water, salts, sugars, fats, proteins. But these in themselves are not living structures. The most basic, fundamental, single unit of a living entity would be defined as the cell, which is called the basic structural unit of all life. Now, you can have living organisms that are only one cell, such as a bacteria or a protozoa, or you can have multicellular organisms like the human body, which is a very complex, if anything, organism. Trillions of cells in the body responsible for all different activities. You may see a picture of a cell in your high school or college biology textbook, which kind of shows all the different parts and structures of the cell, but really well, I shouldn't say no two cells really represent what you usually see in the textbook. The textbook image of a cell is usually what's called a composite cell, or a theoretical cell that has all the components that each and every cell in the body has. As we know, different cells in the body have different structures and different functions, different anatomies and different physiologies. But some of the structural components of the cell include your chromosomes, which are long strands of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, organized into units called genes occurring in the humans. Most living organisms are defined by the number of different chromosomes they have. In the humans, they have 23 identical pairs, 46 altogether. Either one more or one less usually results in what's called a genetic mutation. Organelles are specialized structures within the cytoplasm, or the fluid makeup of the cell, which are basically its parts. Just like the alternator and the carburetor and the voltage regulator are the parts of your car, the nucleus and the ribosomes and the endoplasmic reticulum are all organelles, or specific parts of the whole machine of the cell. Your surface organelles are structures that project from certain cells, such as certain proteins, which act as receptors, proteins that act as messengers. Some cells have what's called flagellum, or whip-like extensions found on sperm cells that help the cell move throughout its environment. So this is basically what I was talking about here. This is an image of what's called a composite cell. I always like to think of the cell as sort of like its own little city of Manhattan. Well, what does a individual city need in order to function? Well, it has its borders, right? The island of Manhattan has the East River, the Hudson River, the Harlem River, and down by Liberty Avenue, or Liberty Island, the water body down there, and is surrounded by its body of water, just like every cell is surrounded by a membrane. For a city to function, it has to have a center of operations, a city hall, just like New York City has downtown by Bleecker Street. City has to have its own power plant, just like the city has Con Ed. Your power plant in your cell is your mitochondria. Some cities are more industrial in nature, having factories for production. Well, those are your Golgi bodies. City has to have a means of transport, of infrastructure, your endoplasmic reticulum. And even most cities have their own sanitation services to collect and discard garbage, so the city's not polluted. Well, your cell has these organelles as well. They're called ribosomes, and these are just a few examples of the specialized organelles of a typical human cell, or typical biological cell. So cells, or the cellular level, is the most basic level of organization in the human body, but several groups of cells, similar cells, grouped together to form a structure are called tissues. These are groups of similar cells that work together to perform a specialized function. And you have four, and really only four types of tissue. You have connective tissue, and as the word implies, it supports and connects all parts of the body, but this also includes bone, blood, fat, cartilage, uh, and as the name implies, it basically binds other parts of the body together. Epithelial tissue covers and protects bodies and lines organs, vessels, and cavities. You find usually on the surface, the interior surface of hollow organs like your blood vessels, your digestive tract, your esophagus, your lymphatic vessels. Their job is to create protective borders. Also, their job is to enhance absorption of materials and secrete materials as well. Next tissue found in the body is muscle tissue, and very simple. Muscle tissue is meant to contract to provide movement. Make it as simple as that. Now, there are different types of muscle tissue that we'll talk about in a few moments, but that's the basic concept of muscle tissue. And then the last tissue to talk about is nerve tissue. The purpose of nerve tissue is to transmit electrical impulses. Yes, electrical impulses, like a human eel. Your body is actually run on electricity. Every muscle contraction, every nerve impulse, every signal from the brain to other parts of your body, every thought process is made up of an electrical activity. And we'll discuss more about that later on, and discuss more of that detail in EKG class. Then several tissues made up to form a certain structure are referred to as an organ. Structures composed of tissues that function together for a common purpose. Your heart, your lungs, your kidney, your stomach, your liver, your pancreas, just to name a few. So, and then finally, a group of different, well, I shouldn't say finally, really. So a group of different functions of organs that function together for a specific purpose result in what's called an organ system. So organ system. Many components of medicine are designed on the study of individual organ systems. So the heart, blood vessels make up the cardiovascular system. So cardiology is the study of the cardiovascular system. Your lungs, your trachea, your windpipe, the parts of the lungs make up the pulmonary system. So a pulmonologist would study that, and so on and so forth. So there are multiple organ systems that make up the ultimate organism, the animal, or in our case, the human being. So let's just go over a few of the basic organ systems, what their major parts are and what their function are. And we'll start with the integumentary system. So some people think the integumentary system just involves the skin, but it's a little more complicated than that. The function of the integumentary system, which includes the skin, the nails, the hair, the structures within the scale, function to, very importantly, protect from bacterial invasion, dehydration, water balance, protection against the sun's rays, regulates body temperature by either releasing water in the form of perspiration or by diverting blood to the core of the body away from the skin to maintain body heat. It eliminates some waste through sweat. Receives environmental stimuli, so it helps you know your place in the world, your touch receptors. Another important function of the skin is the manufacture of vitamin D from sunlight, which is important in the role of calcium metabolism. As I said before, it includes more than just the skin, which is considered the largest organ in the body, but it also includes the exocrine glands, which are oil and sweat glands. The sweat glands help maintain body temperature. The oil glands help maintain the structure and the integrity of the skin. Also includes the hair, which is very important for heat conservation. Your fingernails and toenails have very important function as far as being able to do things such as pick up a dime off a table, or feeling where your foot is planted properly when you're walking. You'd have an interruption in your normal gait or your normal ability to walk if you did not have toenails. And blood vessels, nerves, and sensory organs within the skin are all very important. So as you can see in this image here, you have a diagram of what your typical your integumentary system would look like. So from the most superficial part of the integumentary system includes the epidermis, which is several layers of non-living, for lack of a better word, keratinized cells that make up most of the border of the skin. Then deep to that, you have your dermis, which is the real functional part of the integumentary system. This is what includes the blood vessels, the nerve endings, the oil glands, the sweat glands, the hair follicles, which is really functions in the metabolism of the skin itself. And then deep to the dermis itself is a layer of fatty tissue, uh, that called the subcutaneous layer, which helps one anchor the skin to its underlying structures. It also provides an extra layer of protection and insulation from the outside environment. So again, the epidermis is the outermost and thinnest layer made up of stratified and squamous epithelial cells. You do not have to memorize that for this class. There's no blood supply in the epidermis, so it's basically not really considered a living structure except for the deepest layers. Produces pigments such as melanin and keratin, which are important for functions of the skin, as opposed to the dermis, which is the inner, or I really like to say middle layer, which is composed of all the structures that we just talked about, and the subcutaneous layer, which is connective and adipose tissue, sometimes called the hypodermis as well, depending on what textbook you're reading. As far as the muscular system goes, well, as we mentioned before, its main function is to provide movement, whether it's movement of the organism from place to place in its environment or movement of things within the organism. For our purposes right now, we're going to talk mostly about the skeletal muscles, which are involved in locomotion and heat production, maintenance of posture, and aids in organ function and blood circulation as well. It's just typical contraction of the skeletal muscles is very important for transport of blood throughout the body, to help prevent what's called hemostasis or coagulation of blood, especially in lower extremities. There's different types of muscles. So there's three major types of muscles. There's cardiac muscle, which, as the name implies, is only found in the walls of the heart. And its job is to pump blood out of the heart and has a little bit of a different physiology than the other two mechanisms. Skeletal muscle, which we commonly think about, is attached to bones, and its job is to produce movement at the joints. It's also very important to produce heat to maintain homeostasis. And then you have smooth muscles, which pretty much line the walls of hollow organs, such as your esophagus, your small intestines, and some of your blood vessels. And that's to help propagate transport of materials like food material or blood throughout the body. And so you can see in this diagram right here, you have multiple, what did the slide say? About 700 different types of skeletal muscles. Some are very large and strong and powerful, like your pectoralis in the chest, your latissimus dorsi in the back, your quadriceps in the thigh. And some are extremely small and intrinsic, like the little inner muscles of the spinal column, which are paired up in dozens and dozens of pairs just to make up one function. So, as you can see, there's three different types of muscular tissue. Skeletal muscle is considered voluntary physiologically. Anatomically, it's called striated, the way it appears under a microscope. For the most part, smooth muscle is considered non-striated and involuntary. So you don't really think about what's going on in smooth muscle, although you could sometimes mentally override what happens in your smooth muscle, like if you force yourself to swallow something or bring something up if you're feeling nauseous. Cardiac muscle is significantly different than both types. But skeletal muscle, although it's voluntary, still requires a nervous impulse from the brain to stimulate it to contract to get anything done. Smooth muscle, even though it's involuntary, still requires a nervous impulse, an electrical impulse from the brain traveling down to a nerve to cause that muscle to contract. Although cardiac muscle does require that stimulus as well, Cardiac muscle cells have the ability to actually generate their own impulse regardless of an external nervous stimulation. That's a property cardiac muscle has called automaticity. And that's a term you might want to remember for future reference, automaticity. And that's what leads to the heart being able to generate its own impulse and override the nervous system, which is pretty important in case there's a disruption of the nervous system. The heart can still keep beating and keep the organism alive. So the skeletal system, sometimes some textbooks refer to the musculoskeletal system together, but the skeletal system consists of all your different bones, from long bones to short bones to irregular bones, and the accessory structures as well, the ligaments and the cartilage. And its function is to provide framework to give the body shape and support, to protect internal organs like the rib cage protects the lungs and the heart. It's to provide movement and leverage with the muscular system, because if you had muscles with nothing to pull or act upon, you just have a big blob of jelly rolling around on the floor. The skeletal system also provides a storage depot for calcium, and is very important when calcium levels in the body become too high or too low. Most people know that calcium's function is to build strong bones and teeth, but there are also plenty of other metabolic functions of calcium as well, which plays an important role in muscle contraction and nerve impulses. And finally, one of the big functions of the long bones especially is the production of blood cells in the bone marrow called hemopoiesis. So bones are typically consist of dense connective tissue. They're very complicated structures actually. They're just not long sticks. They consist of bone cells surrounded by hard deposits of calcium salts with networks of communication and nourishment. Bones are living tissue with their own network of blood, lymph, and nerve supply. So injuries to bones can cause bleeding. Multiple bone fractures can cause significant blood loss and hypotension and hypoperfusion and shock. For the most part, they come in four various shapes. You have your flat bones, which are found in your ribs, irregular bones found, for example, in your vertebrae. Most commonly, we think of long bones, such as the forearms, the femur, and short bones found in the carpals or the wrist bones. And you can see an example here. So the bones of your extremities, your upper, your lower arms, your humerus, your radius ulna, those are considered long bones. The bones of the cranium, the ribs, the outer wings of the pelvis are considered flat bones. If you can really look deep into the slide here, you can see very short cube-like bones in the wrist and the ankles called cuboidal bones. And can't really get a good picture here, but if you were to look at the bones of the spinal column, the vertebrae, they're very irregularly shaped. They have different pointy protrusions called processes. They have little holes in them called foramen, and it's pretty interesting to study the anatomy of the back. The joints are where basically two or more bones come together, or what we call articulate. You can have, for our purposes, we'll say three major types of joints. You have hinge joints, which move in only one plane of direction, such as your knee, your elbow. You have ball and socket joints, which have much more mobility, such as the shoulder, which you can move in all sorts of directions and rotate. Same thing as the hip. And then you have immovable joints, which are where two bones are fused together and doesn't really allow for much mobility, yet there's still two different bones together, so we call that space a joint. And around joints, you have these structures called bursa, which are sacs filled with synovial fluid to help lubricate and ease joint movement. If anybody's ever had a condition called bursitis, it can be very painful inflammation of that structure. The nervous system is really your whole command center of what allows the day-to-day functioning, I should actually even say minute-by-minute functioning of the entire body. It's responsible for receiving, inputting, integrating information from the outside environment, and eliciting an appropriate, sometimes inappropriate response, as well as maintaining the daily activity of the internal anatomy and internal area of the body as well. So functionally, it controls and coordinates activities of various body systems by electrical and chemical impulses, both sent and received. So functionally or physiologically, there are two divisions. The somatic nervous system, which is responsible for voluntary movement of skeletal muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which is involved in the involuntary movement of cardiac smooth muscles and glands, as well as other activities in the body as well. So to help remember these two terms, if you look at the word autonomic, what does autonomic kind of sound like? It kind of sounds like the word automatic. So the automatic nervous system, there's really no such thing, but the autonomic nervous system is responsible for the automatic or the involuntary actions of the human body. So the fundamental structure of the nervous system is called the neuron or the nerve cell. And its job is to conduct impulses that allow the body to interact with internal and external environment. And it does so via means of actual electrical impulse. A little bit beyond the scope of this course to explain how that electrical impulse works. But those electrical impulses give rise to chemical reactions and communication to other structures, whether they be a muscle, a gland, or another nerve cell. And each nerve cell consists of three parts: a cell body with a nucleus and organelles, which basically governs the whole process of that nerve cell; dendrites, which are somewhat like your receiving antennas; and axons, which are your transmission bodies. So the central nervous system, so anatomically, the nervous system is composed of two parts: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So we talked about the differences of the physiologic aspects, the somatic versus the autonomic. Anatomically, we can break the nervous system down into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Very simply, the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Those are the two organs of the central nervous system. Don't make it any more complicated than that. These structures are surrounded and cushioned by a cavity filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The brain is housed in the cranial cavity. The spinal cord is housed in the spinal cavity. And both of these structures are protected by three layers of connective tissue called the meninges, the meningeal layer. If you ever heard the term meningitis, meningitis is an inflammation or an infection of these meningeal layers. And then you have the peripheral nervous system, which involves your motor or efferent nerves, which carry impulses from the central nervous system to organs, glands, and muscles; and sensory or afferent nerves carry impulses to the central nervous system from sensory receptors, so your pain receptors, your visual receptors, the things that involved in your special senses. And these are just visual representations of the central nervous system. Here you can see the brain and the spinal cord lying basically in the midline of the body. And then the peripheral nerves that branch off the brain, the cranial nerves off of the brain, the spinal nerves off the spinal cord, make up the peripheral nervous system. And then on the right side, you see a representation of a typical nerve cell or neuron, which has its dendrites at the end, which receive information, the cell body, which processes and integrates information, and then the axon, which is responsible for transmitting that information to other structures. Now, the endocrine system, like the nervous system, is also responsible for affecting the activities of the body, but whereas the nervous system does it in a very rapid, very immediate release type mechanism, the endocrine system is more responsible for maintaining the effects of the human body over the long term in a more time-delayed fashion. And it does so by secreting hormones or chemical messengers into the bloodstream, which affects all things such as metabolism, growth, development, reproduction, personality, response to stress, resistance to disease, as well as many other functions. Okay, your major glands, which are the functional organs of the endocrine system, include things like the pituitary gland, found in the brain, otherwise known as the master gland. It's called the master gland because it directly or indirectly affects many of the other glands in the endocrine system. The pineal gland, found late deep in the brain, which has some functions in sleep-wake cycle, the thyroid gland in the throat near the voice box, which is responsible for metabolism, calcium production, the parathyroids right next to the thyroids, which have even uh, more of an effect on calcium metabolism. The thymus in the chest, right behind the sternum, is mostly active during early childhood, where it helps prime the immune system and program certain white blood cells. The adrenal glands, located on the top of the kidney, which produce hormones such as cortisol and oh, what's the other one I'm looking for? Cortisol and oh, cortisol and epinephrine. I'm sorry, epinephrine, which is the technical term for adrenaline. The islands of Langerhans in the pancreas help produce insulin, which is a chemical messenger hormone very important in glucose metabolism. And the testes and the ovaries are also affected by hormones released by the pituitary gland in the maintenance of sexual activity. There are other structures in the body that produce and release hormones that are not traditionally associated with the endocrine system, but still have very important functions as well. The heart ventricles secrete a hormone called BNP, beta natriuretic peptide, which functions in maintenance of water reabsorption and blood vessel size for blood pressure. The kidneys secrete erythropoietin, sometimes known as epigen when it's artificially made, EPO, to stimulate red blood cell production. Stomach lining secretes a hormone to stimulate digestion. Placenta secretes hormones that affect function during pregnancy, such as pitocin. And again, here's a visual representation of what the endocrine system would look like with all of its glands and accessory glands. And the field of endocrinology is pretty interesting because it works on what's called a feedback mechanism. So the function of one gland will usually either inhibit or enhance the function of its previous gland. And it's pretty interesting that when you take anatomy and physiology 301 and 302, you'll learn more about. So the digestive system, just as it says there, is important to take in food because we need nourishment, breaks that food down into usable components for absorption, and most importantly, I shouldn't say most importantly, but just as importantly, eliminates the parts of food that you don't actually need. So when we refer to the major structures of the digestive system, we refer to the gastrointestinal or GI tract, which includes the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestines. But there are also organs that are not part of the digestive system, which are called accessory organs, which include the lips, the teeth, the tongue, salivary glands, the liver, very important for secreting substances to help break down foods. The pancreas, just as well, helps secrete digestive enzymes, and the gallbladder for storage of bile, which can help break down fats. The digestive system also includes the accessory organs that we've talked about. And you can see this visual representation right here. It starts all the way from the beginning of the mouth and it's all the way down to the bottom of the rectal opening called the anus and everything in between. Now, the reproductive system is the only organ system that in itself is not necessary for the survival of the organism, but it is necessary for the survival of the species throughout time. So the function is to produce gametes needed to form a new human being or new organism through the production of spermatozoa in males and ova in females. And sexual reproduction is very important at the species level to exchange genetic information so that the species can survive throughout changes of environment and keep the species prolonged over the courses of long periods of time. If every single individual in a single species had the same exact genetic material, one single disease or one single fluctuation in climate could wipe out the entire species. Sexual reproduction helps ensure the survival of the species through genetic changes and mutations over the course of time. And this is a visual representation of the different organ structures of the male and female reproductive system. The urinary system is involved in filtering waste products from the blood by creating urine. It's also very important in the maintenance of fluid and electrolyte balance in the body as well. By regulating body fluids, it either eliminates too much water or reabsorbs water in times of water deficit. And the structures include the kidney, which includes the nephrons, which are the working units of the kidney, the ureters, which transport urine from the kidney to bladder, the bladder, which actually stores the urine, and then the urethra, which is the tube that finally transports the urine from the bladder outside the body at hopefully the most appropriate time. So you can see here the kidneys are located up in what's called the retroperitoneal cavity. Some textbooks refer to the kidneys as being in the abdominal cavity. That's not 100% accurate. They're not really found within the abdominal cavity itself. They're more so behind the abdominal cavity, behind this lining of the abdominal cavity called the peritoneum. But we won't hold you to that standard when we go over this stuff later on. Then you can see the ureters traveling down from the left and right kidney to the bladder where urine is ultimately excreted. The kidneys or the renal system is hooked up to the vascular system where blood will travel into the kidney for filtering and processing, and then it will return back to the bloodstream as its activities have been processed. Now, the respiratory system is obviously one of the most important systems of the body. External respiration involves the oxygen from air entering the bloodstream and the lungs, and carbon dioxide leaving the bloodstream and entering air from the lungs. So intake of oxygen, release of waste products of carbon dioxide. Internal respiration involves oxygen leaving the bloodstream and entering cells in a tissue, and the release of carbon dioxide from the cells into the bloodstream. So many people think respiration just refers to the process of breathing in and out. It's a little more complex than that. It involves the process of proper gas exchange and transport, and it also maintains an important function in balancing the pH, the acid-base balance of your body. The major structures of the respiratory system include the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the lungs, and the alveoli. And as you can see right here, the major components of the respiratory system are the lungs, which are housed within the thoracic cavity that we spoke about. The respiratory system is typically divided into the upper airway versus the lower airway. The upper airway contains structures such as the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, the nasopharynx, oropharynx, the laryngopharynx, the trachea. Most references would differentiate the border between the upper airway and the lower airway at the level of the trachea. So once you start getting into the thoracic cavity, now you're talking about the structures of the lower airway itself, which includes the bronchi, the bronchioles, and ultimately the end component of the respiratory system, which are the alveoli, which is the very bubbly membranous sacs that look like vines of grapes, where oxygen is exchanged from the airway into the bloodstream. And so the respiratory system works pretty intimately with the cardiovascular system by bringing oxygen into the bloodstream, having it circulated and returned to the heart to be pumped out to all the other parts of the body. And once all the blood that has fed all the cells of the body in oxygen returns back to the heart, then it's pumped back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen and drop off more carbon dioxide in a continuous cycle. And so this will be gone over a little bit more during class as well. So just to recap, the competencies that should be met in this week's lesson are to demonstrate the basic understanding of the anatomy and the main body systems and anatomic terminology in order to relate major areas in the clinical laboratory to general pathologic conditions associated with the body systems. Describe the basic functions of each of the main body systems. Demonstrate basic knowledge of the circulatory, urinary, and other body systems necessary to perform assigned specimen collection. Now, we didn't focus too much on the cardiovascular system in this lesson because we will be doing that at a different point in time in this course. The cardiovascular system, or the circulatory system, is the real backbone of what we are going to be learning during phlebotomy, so we're going to gear more of our efforts to learning about it a little bit more in detail on the next presentation. So hopefully, if there's no questions, please study up, prepare for class. If you do have any questions, please email me or post them in the forum on Blackboard for the rest of the class to share. And with that, have a great day.